Hey everybody, and welcome to the Getting Litty With It podcast. I am your host, Maddie B. With me is my sister, Tracy. Before we get started on this episode, I just wanted to give you guys all a fair warning that this is the episode that I have been telling you guys for a couple weeks now. Still alive, a Holocaust Girlhood Remembered. It's going to be serious conversations, dark and real, so if you're uncomfortable with it, now's your chance to stop listening.
So I wanted to start a little bit with the technicality of how the book is written, mostly because this is a very sensitive topic, and I think that once we start getting into the actual content of it, um, there's just no way to go back to this. And I think it's really important to talk about the technical aspects because how she writes is almost as important as what she writes. So I personally found a couple of contradictory feelings of mine while reading this. First of all, the language she uses is beautiful. It's very poetic, which makes sense because, as you told me earlier, she is a poet and she references poetry a lot during this
Yes.
book.
So she is a world-renowned poet, actually. I've had the pleasure of looking into some of her poetry because you know how I love poetry, and she has some poems written about this time specifically that are just so real and raw, and I really suggest you look them up. Her name is Ruth Kluber. I mean, it brought just a lot of emotion to me personally reading them, so I really suggest everybody takes a look. And if you don't want to read this book, at least check out some of her poetry. It's worth the read.
So for that alone, the book is worth reading. Like I said, her word choices and the comparisons she makes and the similes and metaphors she uses are beautiful, and combined with this context, it really brings a human side, I think, to the story. So it's not just shoving another Holocaust story in your face. I know that it is quite possible to get Holocaust fatigue from reading so much stuff, but I think that this story and the way she writes it, really prevents that because
Um,
it's not sugar coated and it's written beautifully.
I would also
Um,
like to point out, though, quickly with the Holocaust fatigue. If you guys are reading about the Holocaust and you're researching it, or you're interested in World War II, take it in small doses because, like anything else in this life, the more you read something, the more you look at it, you'll grow numb to it. And it's just so
yes,
important to not get numb to this topic. So take it in small doses. If you start feeling like you're just looking at it at a historical standpoint or just reading it because you're interested and you're not feeling anything anymore, take a break because this is such an important topic that just can't disappear into the archives of history.
exactly. Um, so I think that's really important to note when you're reading anything that's Holocaust related, because it is a very, very heavy topic. And I know that there are varying degrees of literature that cover it, like, for instance, Number the Stars, um, is it discusses the Holocaust, but it doesn't go into the horrors of it so much because it's more geared towards children and educating them. Um, but that's through the eyes of somebody who's not Jewish and is just helping their Jewish friend. And then you have stories such as Night, which is nonfiction for anybody who hasn't read it, and is unrelenting in its honesty.
I think
So
what's really interesting there and what you said about the story kind of being like just not showing the true monstrosity of this whole situation because it was geared for kids is
mhm,
they did the same thing with the Diary of Anne Frank when they wrote it. Not the actual release copy that you can go get at Barnes and Noble or something if you want to read it yourself, but like the school version of it that they put in schools because that thing is like half the size of the real thing and keeps so much out of it because they don't think children are ready to witness something with that. And I can disagree more. I don't think this should be something that is if you don't think children are ready for it, then wait until they're older to teach them. But I don't think this is something that should be dumbed down just because it's kids. Either they're ready to hear about it or they're not. But like, you're not
well,
doing justice to anybody by doing that.
with the Diary of Anne Frank, I don't believe it was schools leaving stuff out to protect children. It was more that her father refused to let them publish some of the pages because it embarrassed him, his family, because you know
I I do understand
they
what you're
they
saying, but
they well,
that's not the parts that I'm talking about that the school's taken out.
okay. Well, I know that with with him, um, they've put some of those entries back in newer published versions since he passed away.
I mean,
I don't know off the top of my head if that was him, if he gave them permission pre his death to do that after he dies, or if they just took it upon themselves. I hope he gave them permission because that to me would kind of be a little bit of an insult to him, but I don't know off the top of my head.
yeah, I mean, to be fair though, I'm speaking based on knowledge and information I have from when I was in middle school, which was 15 years ago now. So I don't have the most up to date info either.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I taught the Diary of Anne Frank last year, but it's very difficult to teach because getting used copies of the book, you have to be very careful because there's so many different editions and they have different things in them and different things taken out. Because you have to remember that this is about a real girl and she had a real family. And even though they're held up as like, look, as like the symbol of what Jewish people went through, they were humans. So they fought like families fight. You know, they had their issues. Nobody was perfect. Um, and most of us are blessed in that those things in our lives are kept private, but because of what they went through, it's, it's now out in the public eye. Um,
I think what's
so
really really cool about it though, just to bring it back to Still Alive and the relation to Anne Frank, other than just they're both about the Holocaust, is reading both of those books side by side, which I'll admit I haven't done yet, but I really should go back and read the Diary of Anne Frank now because you're seeing in Still Alive the Holocaust through the eyes of a childhood
mhm,
memory from a grown woman,
yeah,
and memories change as you get older, even traumatic ones.
mhm,
You'll remember it
yes,
differently as older you get, right? The Diary of
mhm,
Anne Frank is just a pure in the moment, not even a memory. Like she's jotting down what she's going through at that very second, and the
right,
comparison of the narrative there and how they wrote.
yeah,
Um, I think it would be
but it
cool to analyze and read them side to side, and I wish I did that before this podcast. But
absolutely, but I think that unfortunately, because of the nature of the Diary of Anne Frank in comparison to this book, the Diary of Anne Frank takes place completely before her arrest and her being put into the camps. So really, to compare the two, you would have to compare the entirety of the diary with just the first part of still alive, because sadly Anne Frank's story ends. Thankfully, Ruth's does not, but it would be interesting to compare those two parts, I think.
Yeah, definitely. In the
Um,
most respectful manner
abs-
we can,
Absolutely.
in like just a literary sense of a teenage girl's writing versus the writing of a world-renowned poet
Yep.
who was quite interestingly enough younger than Anne Frank was when this all went down.
Yes.
When it started, I think when she actually went to the camp, I believe they were about the same age. So I think I'll retract that because
Um,
on technicalities, I think Ruth Cooper is a year younger than Anne Frank was when she actually went to the camp.
I believe Anne went to the camps when she was 14, and she
This diary takes
died
place
when
when
she was,
she's 13, so
yeah, and
yeah, that
I
makes
think she
sense.
died when she was 15, and Ruth, if I'm remembering correctly, ends up in the camps when she's 12.
It's
Because
that's what
that's a big
I
part of the story,
I
is that
believe
she
it's
has
when
to lie
she's
about her age.
I believe it's when she's 12 as well. However, the way she writes the book, her age and the timing can kind of be a little confusing at times.
Yeah, that is the one conflicting thing I had about the story in terms of how it's written, is that because she's writing from memory and she's kind of processing it as she's telling us it can feel very disjointing at times, um, and feels like she goes off onto these tangents that, the comparisons are great, but it makes following the chronological piece very difficult sometimes.
Like, I think that's an important aspect to mention here is that if you're looking to read like a chronological Holocaust story of start to finish, you're not going to get that in this book. This book is strictly, like the title said, her Holocaust Girlhood Remembered. So, like, we remember things and we talk to each other, and we have conversations and they get out of order. It's still very similar. This book is written
Right,
almost in a way that she's just talking to you and just writing down what she's talking.
right.
Um,
And
I also
there's a
want to
few
make
times there's a few times where she'll repeat herself, and it's clear that she's like she didn't realize that she already said that, or even she'll write and tell you her thought process about how she wrote the previous page and then went to bed and then woke up and reread it and mulled over the idea of deleting it, and then goes on this thought process about how she couldn't know what she was talking about prior to the previous page and blah blah. Um, so it really is like not entirely like reading a book. It's like having a counseling session with her in a way, or an interview session with her,
I like the
but
use
in a
of
written form.
I definitely like the use of interview session
Yes.
because I think this book is so unique in the fact that it is now the year 2023 and the Holocaust started in the late 1930s, and the amount of people who were alive in that time is dwindling down fewer and fewer every day. So
Mhm.
getting to read this book, say 20 years from now, right? When nobody's here to actually speak to us and like do their actual recounts of what happened is like the opportunity of interviewing somebody. And that's a unique perspective.
Um,
And but I would like to go back on the literary part because you mentioned earlier that it's like because she's writing directly from memory. A really unique thing
yes.
about the American version of this book is that she said and she made a promise that she was not going to publish this book in English until her mother passed away because her mother didn't want this book being out and people in New York where she lived seeing it and like knowing her story and stuff. Um, but the English translation of this book isn't just a copy of the German book translated to English. She rewrote the
Mhm.
entire book in English. So the English book is actually a little different than the German book due to the fact that the
Yep.
English book is a memory of a memory of a memory because it's
Right.
her memory of writing the first book. And I thought that is very interesting.
Absolutely. Because that kind of makes it so it's not possible to lose things in translation, obviously, because it wasn't translated. So
Which that is part of
it's
why I wanted to say that, because you people listening could be like, well, maybe it was different and it was a little hard to follow because it was lost in translation. This was a book that was fully written in English. There's a
um
line in the book actually towards the end of the book where she says that make no mistake that this is not a copy of the German book, that this is a new book.
yeah.
So
I want to read a quote just to give you guys an idea of some of the unique and like clever word choices she uses. This particular quote I really enjoyed because of the end of the sentence, which I'll talk about when, I get there. So, Hans did get out, and I was to meet him again in England when I was no longer 8 years old, but the way I am now, impatient and absent minded, prone to drop things intentionally or through clumsiness, even breakables like dishes and love affairs. So I really loved her saying even breakables like dishes and love affairs. I thought that was very clever. Um, and it was actually that's in chapter one, and it's on my book. It was page 14. So that's very very early on in the book, and it was actually that sentence that I was like, I'm going to love her writing.
well, my favorite part of her writing style is that you're getting like half narrative, like just half first person account on what's going on, and
Yeah.
then you get half poetry. Like she writes it in such a poetic manner
Yes.
that like I was hooked at every line because I just felt like I was reading through one of my poetry books, and I was like, her language and word choice and just the way she describes the most simple of scenes, like she describes going on a train ride and just what she
Yes.
sees out the train compared to what the boys in the camp on the outside see. Um, and some context, this isn't boys in the camps. This is like Aryan German kids in their normal summer camp watching just a train go by, and they're looking at the
Yeah.
same scene, but it's not the same picture. And just her words cut deep, and
Yes.
I think it's just very poetic. And one of my favorite things about this book, and that I just to speak on a positive note here, is that ever since reading this book, I got my love for writing and writing poetry back, and I've been writing like nonstop
Awesome.
just due to her language,
Yeah.
just her word choices and her describe. Because I think that's my favorite part of poetry, as you've seen from some of my writing and stuff, is I like to describe poetry as painting a picture with words,
Mhm.
and I think she absolutely just nails that line after line. I can visibly, it's like I'm just sitting in the room with her and I can see what she's seeing.
100%.
And sometimes you want to turn your
Um,
head away from the book because you don't want to see what she's seeing.
right. It can be very traumatic, but it's important. And just to go back to the poetry aspect, she writes like a poet, but she also makes it clear that poetry has always been a big part of her life, and it actually helped her through this period of time in her life, um, from before she and her mom were sent to the camps, through the camps, and even after. Um, so before they're sent to the camps, when they are allowed to do less and less recreational things, she reads a lot of poetry and she commits it to memory because she loves it so much, and she'll recite poems to people that were written by other people. Um, and that's when she's really young, and that's like super important to her. And it causes some friction between her and some of her relationships, but it's definitely something that she uses as a coping skill, in my opinion. And
And we
then
are
in the
absolutely lucky
camps,
enough to have gotten the chance to see what she can write, because this
Yes.
is a young girl who could have had a very dramatically different outcome.
Yes.
But not only that, she was a young girl in the 1930s, so like not even Holocaust related. But she was a
Hmm.
young woman in the 1930s, and in the 1930s, they expect a woman to be a certain way. You were the housewife, you were this, you were what your husband wanted you to be. And creative writers and artists and things like that were very taboo back then. So
Yeah.
from early on, um, there was a stigma about her, that could have easily, for someone who was not as strong-willed, broke them, and we would have never experienced this a day in our life.
And also, she touches upon some of the sexism that's inherent in some aspects of Judaism, in which, like, the women aren't supposed to look at the holy books. And she talks about how she wanted to read stories from the Bible because she wanted to read about her namesake, and her uncle scolded her for doing it. And so she was kind of forced in the direction of these other writers in the poetry. And then so they kind of became this like rebellious act. So just reading and memorizing these poems, knowing that people in her life who annoy her, like her uncle, would disapprove of it, was like incredibly important to her. And you'll see that in her personality through a lot of the story, is that a lot of her motivation is to like give the middle finger to people who want to tell her what to do.
Um, yeah, and I just, with the whole poetry thing, which I think is a wonderful, wonderful outlet for anybody, what truly strikes me and just makes me, I don't even know how to describe it, just makes me feel something, is
Yeah.
that as a little girl, she looked up to these poets. Like, there's these famous English poets, famous German poets, all these poets that, like, the rest of the world looked down upon because why are men writing like this? That's not masculine and stuff like that. Those men that she got to like idolize and turned her into a writer, and after reading her book and me idolizing her the way that she idolized them,
Yeah.
just that openness and how she idolized them and stuff, and she didn't care that they were less masculine than other men because they wrote. It doesn't matter. So that opened the door not only for women in writing and creativity and just the world in general, because what she's done behind the scenes for like women's rights and stuff can't be understated either. But she opened the door for people like me who can now go and feel comfortable writing, and hopefully one day can have another generation look up to me the same way that I now look up to her, and encourage them to write and want to express themselves. So what those guys did for her is what she did for me, and there's a special connection there that I don't know her
Yeah.
personally. She doesn't know me personally, but it doesn't matter because she didn't know these guys personally, and they meant the world to her. You know what I mean? And
Right.
she gave me that same feeling that these guys gave her, and I just think there's a really unique, special connection there that was given to us through writing.
Oh, absolutely. So, I think it's also important to talk about how while she's in the camps, poetry is still something that helps her cope with the horrors, you know? Uh, but instead of it being poetry written by other people, she's writing her own poetry. And because, you know, Jewish prisoners weren't given pen and paper, she had to write it in a way that she would be able to memorize it. And then she would memorize it and she would recite it to other prisoners. And it was a way of her rebelling even then so that she didn't have to just sit there and take everything. She still, at least in her head, got to stick it to people who were telling her what to do.
With the writing and it just setting this powerful scene, because I think you don't get the true story without her writing. You know what I mean? Like her style of writing
Yeah.
makes this whole story, and I think we should probably get into a little bit of about what's actually going on in this story. So. The thing that strikes me the most about this story, and I'm not going to go in chronological order because she didn't go in chronological order, so it's only fitting, is in the middle of reading this story, I decided to go back and I watched Schindler's List, right? And at the time that movie was made, it was like the most realistic, just heart-wrenching depiction of the Holocaust, and it's a very true to the what happened movie, and it's very accurate and stuff like that. And part of what makes that movie great is also his flaws. Like what makes this book is she's very open about her flaws too, and I think there's a common connection there and stuff of even
Absolutely.
flawed people can do great things. With that
Yes.
said, I think what is so mesmerizing and what I took away from this book compared to Schindler's List is however historically accurate Schindler's List was, the way it depicts the Jewish people who were these weak, lesser people who couldn't fend for themselves and they needed someone like Schindler to save them, which isn't like necessarily wrong, but I like in her book you hear these heroic stories of just, and heroic to us because we weren't there and seeing it and in the middle of it and stuff, but
Right.
for her it was just survival and stuff, but she wasn't there being like hoping that this person saved them or this and that. Like she fended for herself, she took care of herself, and I think reading her story compared to watching Schindler's List and watching this movie and seeing this guy just do these great things to help the Jewish people, it was a nice change to read something about the Jewish people helping themselves, because a lot of what's lost in conversation about the Holocaust is all we ever do is talk about the Jews and how they were victims.
Yes.
And she comes in this place and we get to see a side of it where they're heroes and they're heroic, and she did these amazing heroic things and they seem so little if you just say them out loud without context, but like her and her friend in the camp and stuff when they were on kitchen duty preparing and they stole food and stuff, like little things to help themselves survive and stuff. But I think it's just really important to remember that these weren't just victims that bent over and let this happen to them, that they did fight for themselves. And she shows it in the ghettos, they fought for themselves, in the trains, in the camps, these people fought. I don't think enough literature, movies, anything about the Holocaust shows that representation enough. It's always about how they're the
I
victims needing to be saved, but these people fought for themselves till the end.
I also think it's important that, she points out that when Holocaust stories are told, even if they're about real people, they tend to generalize the Jewish experience and um, generalize the personalities of the Jewish prisoners. So they become a caricature themselves rather than, you know, people.
Exactly.
And
That's
it's
what
it's
I'm
very
saying.
it's very important to remember that they were people. Um,
They were
so
doctors, they were teachers, they were nurses, they were poets, writers,
right.
construction men, anything you can
But
imagine.
I think it's also important to note that while there were people who did heroic things, like what we would see as typically heroic, where they were stealing food or, rebelling by writing poetry and stuff like that. I think it's also important to make it clear that the Jewish people who didn't do those things, that tried to stay under the radar and just follow directions, you know, they're not any less heroic just because they didn't make those bold movements. I don't think any of us can speak about this with any kind of accuracy about what it must have been like to be there and what we would have done in that situation. You know what I'm saying?
I
Um,
100% agree with you. And I'm not saying anything less of the people who just survived, lived their day, or the people who um didn't.
didn't.
Um, I'm not speaking anything of those just because just being in that situation and just doing what you can to survive is heroic in itself. Um, I guess the overall point that I was just trying to make was what you said best, that um, not enough media outlets show that side of the Jewish community in um, their um, sources. They always go back to, like you said, the caricature, and that Jewish caricature is that they're just they're always the victims needing somebody else to save them.
Right.
And that is something that's like not only in
It's the
like
it
literature, movies and stuff, but that's like in real life too. Did you like I've seen pictures of like Jewish people who survived the camps in complete shock and just like completely just drained of all humanity. Um, and American soldiers posing with them with these big smiles on their face and stuff like that because they're the heroes. You know what I mean?
right. It's
And
a white savior complex.
ex-
And and the and the unfortunate part of it is that it's not just in regards to the Holocaust. You see it a lot. For instance, with The Blind Side, the real hero of that story, who should have been focused on, was the young boy who overcame all these odds and became a professional football player. But instead, the focus of the entire story is on the blonde white mother who saved him, quote unquote. You know, um, we see that with Schindler's
which
List. I think that's a little bit there's a little bit of a nuance there because I know that Jewish people revere him because of what he did and he was a real person. I mean, not that the other story wasn't about real people, but I know that he's revered by Jewish
by the
people,
point that
and
movie
I
The Blind Side was made, it really wasn't about real people anymore though. There's a lot of
right, it's Hollywoodized,
falsities.
but
Um,
I'm sure that Schindler's List was also victim to Hollywood editing. But my point is that while Schindler's story is good to be told because this is somebody that Jewish people really looked up to and respected, and he really was heroic and saved a lot of lives. Um, it again creates this white savior and focuses on him and his life and the guilt he went through. Which is why I think that it's really important that we read stories like Still Alive and we put a lot of focus on them because that's focusing on people who went through it, and they weren't the victims in the sense of they acted like victims, but they were the ones who were at the brunt of these heinous acts.
yeah, and going back on Schindler's List, a couple problems I have with the way that was portrayed too is once again the Jews were used as supporting characters in his hero's journey. And I get that it's a true story, but
Mhm.
the Holocaust and the Jewish people themselves were a setting for his character development. You know what I mean? Um,
Right.
and it was a true enough story, the movie, but once again, it's a movie about a white man saving Jewish people when there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff in the real story that was just as important that didn't make it into the movie. And
Yeah.
I'm not even discussing just like what the Jewish people did because each one of those Jewish people have heroic stories that were left out of that movie too. But his wife
Right.
was just as much of a part of saving them as he was.
Right.
And that is not talked about at all in the movie. It's like briefly mentioned, and in a way that it's her supporting him for doing what he's doing. But when in real life she had a way more active role, but it didn't fit the Hollywood narrative as well because they wanted it to be this white male hero.
Right. And I think it's important also to reflect on this movie and the white savior complex in general, and that yes, it's good for this stuff to be told. The world needs to be educated, but when you remember the white characters as actual characters, but you can't name any of the Jewish characters, that's a problem.
It is a problem. I watched
And
this movie a
and
week ago. I watched this movie a week ago, and I can name the Nazi camp leader, and I
yep,
can name Oscar Schindler.
right. And they shouldn't be the only ones that you remember the names, you know?
Exactly,
And
and
that
that's not
happens a
on
lot.
me, the viewer, because I tuned out the Jewish names or anything like that. That's on the way the movie was made to not put importance on their names.
Right. And, I think that we're trying
They were
in
summed up as
American
Schindler's Jews.
society. Right. I think that we're trying in American society to push forward into a more inclusive and diverse way. Um, and that's great. But I think that it's it bears mentioning that, you know, the two movies that we just mentioned, they weren't made in like 1970.
To be fair,
Um,
for the counter argument of that is Schindler's List is from the early 90s, and we have changed
Still the 90s.
drastically with our view in the last, I'd say, 10 years.
Yes,
I
I agree
not
with
that
that.
doesn't make
But
it
I
right. That doesn't
also
make it right at all.
right.
But the context of the time that it was made is all I'm saying.
But also it's important to point that out because people have this idea that you know, these racist, anti-Semitic beliefs and these white savior tropes and the kind of whitewashing of history that it was like, back in the day when we weren't as cultured as we did it as before we understood. And it's like, okay, but back in the day was when I was alive and I'm only in my 30s.
And
You
I
know what I'm
think
saying? So it's we're not removed from that.
with that said, I think like with Schindler's List and stuff like that is remember the time that it was made, understand that it was a different time, but also still have these conversations. Don't accept that it's okay.
Right.
You could still discuss why that's not okay and move forward and be better in the future. You can't just sit there and be like, "Oh, well, that was from this time, so it doesn't matter." It does matter. We're still watching
Right.
it today. It's still prevalent today. Um, I think another um, interesting thing I took from the book, which um, bothered me probably more than is appropriately okay because I didn't experience it and I wasn't there. So who am I to judge her thoughts? Um, was some of the things she talked about with Jews that went to the gas chambers and stuff, and grown men climbing over children trying to escape and things like that and stuff.
Oh
And
yeah, I have that quote. hold
Okay.
on, because I was gonna talk about that too. That sibling energy there.
Yeah, so I'll let you get to that
So
quote, and then I'll continue
the
with what I can say.
the symbolic claptrap was a kind of security blanket. For since we have researched everything about the fate of the victims, we know how they died in the gas chambers. The strong climbed on top of the weak in that last agony as they choked. So the men were always on top when they pulled out the corpses, and the women and children at the bottom.
It's one of those situations that we talked about that we can't. It's so easy to just read those lines as an outsider and be like, what the hell is wrong with these men? And I look at my children, I'm like, I'll never do that. That's sickening. And how could they do that and stuff? But it's
Hmm.
important to remember that this was, I was going to say life and death, but it wasn't even life or death. This was just death. It was just pure panic.
Right.
You go into instinct mode and you do what you have to
100%.
do to survive. And I think it's important to remember those moments because it was so easy to just be like, well, the grown men Jews, what cowards and stuff for doing that to the women and children. But
Hmm.
none of us would do any different. And to
Nope.
say we would is an insult and stuff. And quite frankly, a
Absolutely.
deluded hero complex because they weren't actively thinking, I need to climb on these children again. It was just panic. It was just, they weren't thinking at all. It was survival. It was just instinct.
Right. They were desperate to get fresh air.
And,
And and that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about, you know, there were people who, you know, didn't do what she did and didn't do what we would typically think of as heroic. And there were even people who did what we would think of as cruel. And how could they do that to their fellow Jewish people? And it, it's such a horrific situation that it is imperative that we don't be judgmental.
and yeah, I think it's important to remember that they didn't do this to their fellow Jewish people. The Nazis did this to all of them.
And they were
And
trying to survive. And for some of them, that meant turning their humanity off a little bit
this goes
and
for
doing things that they wouldn't have done normally.
and this goes for Jews who are ratting on each other too. And um I've seen it a lot in the school and the way they talk about it in school and stuff, and just growing up and just researching the Holocaust and stuff. The Jewish people that they had policing their ghettos and stuff like that. Um, it was still a level of survival. Now, there is stories, and I'm not going to say there's not, of there was absolutely Jewish people in these ghettos who were I wish I remembered the name that they called the Jewish cops. They got power hungry and they would like they fed off that power and talked down to their fellow Jews and stuff like that. And I've seen a lot of time where they're compared to Nazis. And I'm not saying that
They're
they were
not.
the
It's not
greatest
the
of
same
people
thing.
and stuff, but you can't compare them to Nazis because they're still victims of this situation too. Um,
Yes.
so while there's different levels of it, which she goes on to talk about in the book too, and I think that goes back to the caricature too, that there is different levels of victims in this as well, and different
Hmm.
struggles that everybody has gone through and dealt with in it and stuff, and faced different things. Whether you went to a work camp or they went to straight to the gas chamber off the bus or whatever, at the end of the day, even the Jewish police there and the men climbing on the bodies and stuff, we just can't look away from the fact that they too were victims and they should be remembered in a positive light as much as anybody else.
Right. And, um, you know, we think about what they went through, and a lot of people will generalize and simplify it. It's like, oh, they were starving. Oh, they were worked to exhaustion. Um, but it wasn't just that. I mean, that alone would be enough to cause people to do things to survive. Um, but you have to remember the setting they were in. They were seeing horrifying things, like extremely horrifying, that would make horror movies look like Sesame Street, you know? Um,
We're talking every minute of every day, like a constant
right,
fear, like your worst anxiety times whatever. Like there's nothing to compare it to make a similarity because there's nothing quite like this what
right.
they went through either.
I'm gonna I'm gonna read a quote, and again, I'm gonna warn everybody, this is really intense, um, stuff, very vivid. If you are uncomfortable or triggered by anything similar, don't listen to this part, um, and probably don't read the book because there's a lot of this in it. But this quote comes from the section on the death camp, um, because she went to a death camp first and then got transferred to a forced labor camp. So the quote goes, and the naked corpses heaped on a truck, piled up any which way, and molested by flies. The disfigured features that had faced the ultimate violence, the hair on their heads disheveled, sparse pubic hair, all in the glaring sun. Lisel runs away in a panic. I stand and stare in fascination. So now imagine being 12 years old and that's what you're seeing. Grown men and women in the military end up with PTSD and years of therapy for seeing stuff like that. For seeing less than that.
Well,
And this 12-year-old girl had to see that. And dozens, dozens of children had to see that. It it wasn't just adults in those camps.
the troops that stormed Normandy on D-Day at Omaha Beach and stuff like that
Yep.
are the same troops that crossed over through France and through Europe to get to the Battle of Berlin and ultimately win the war. On their way to these places, they came across the camps. They had no clue what these camps were. They never heard of them, anything like that, and they came across them. And what is crazy to me is everything they saw in World War II and all the violence and gore and everything they went to. These guys can't remember seeing the guy next to them shot and killed. They can't remember seeing the people they shot and killed. They can't remember seeing the battles and stuff like that. There's two things that stuck with them that they can remember. One is the shores of Omaha Beach, like the water was literally painted pink from
Mhm.
the blood of all the people who got shot coming off the boats before they even made it to the shore. And like
Mhm.
when I say pink, I mean like the white caps on the waves crashing, and that foam.
Yep.
That
Yep.
foam was just straight pink.
Yep.
Um and they remember that, and but the thing that keeps them up at night and the thing that gave them PTSD and the thing that just completely mentally changed them forever. And I'm sure the battles would have if they didn't experience this worst thing to them. But
Mhm.
the thing that stuck with them and caused them PTSD and just never was the same was when they stumbled upon the camp and saw the Jews for the first time.
Yep.
Imagine seeing somebody in such bad condition that you have PTSD for the rest of your life. And
Mhm.
that was the monstrosity. And that was what the Nazis did. And that is the treatment that they got, that grown men have PTSD forever from seeing another human being.
Now imagine being the people who were put through all of this to become the people that caused nightmares to these soldiers. It's horrifying.
Exactly.
Um,
Um,
and I just want one of the things that I really, really enjoy about Ruth, I don't know if enjoy is the right word. One of the things that I really respect about her, is that she makes comments on all the stuff that we're talking about, and she doesn't hold back her opinions. So, one of the quotes she says is, "Later in life, nothing offended me more than the generalization that the camps turned us all into brutal egotists, and whoever survived them must be morally defective. Again, the blithe refusal to look closely, to make distinctions, to reflect a little." It's so easy to be like, yeah, the Nazis were bad, but look at what some of the Jews did. And like you see that even with slavery. Like, yeah, the white people who brought slaves to America were bad, but take a look at those tribal leaders who sold their own people. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's always that kind of scapegoat thing going on. And um,
and I think,
she comes right out and says that it offends her.
yeah, and I think if you can sit there and with a straight face and say Nazis are bad and follow that with a but, you're not
Right.
really somebody I want to be associated with personally as a Jewish person. And
Yes, I
maybe that's
agree.
not politically correct to say on this podcast, but quite frankly, I don't want you being my listener anyway, if that's how you feel, because that
I don't
sentence
think
should.
that there's I don't think
th-
there's
th-
anything not politically correct about that
But
statement.
you know what I'm
I
saying?
think
Like that sentence should
yeah,
end at Nazis are bad.
right.
There's no
I
but
think
that takes away from how bad they are.
right,
You want to have
right.
that conversation about, oh, so and so in the Jewish community was bad. You can have that conversation separate, and you don't have to include Nazis in it. There's no but. Nazis were bad. Um,
Right.
and I think what I just find um disgusting, gross, a negligent account on history is that
Mhm.
time and time again we can generalize the Jewish community, like we've been talking about how they're generalized and everything all the time, right?
Right.
But then we talk about Nazis, right? And
Mhm.
we don't generalize Nazis. We don't sit there and be like, well, all Nazis are bad. We'll be like, well, this Nazi wasn't so bad because, or this Nazi who was a doctor saved a lot of people in the camps because he said they needed to live to, so he kept experimenting on them to save them lives.
This
Or
Nazi revealed to the girl that she should lie about her age so
all of
she was
us,
saved. So she
so
must
she can go to the
be
work,
a
so
good
she can go to a
person.
work camp, by the way.
Right. Right.
I'm just putting that out there so she can go to a different horrible camp. And the only difference between the death camps and the work camps was how you died. Death camps, you went to the
Right.
gas chambers and you instantly died. Work camps, they worked you to death. You worked till you
Right.
died. That was the goal. That was the end plan.
Right. They literally were like, "You're no use to us. You can't be
Um,
productive. You're going straight to the gas chambers. You can be productive, so we're gonna use you until we can't use you anymore, and then goodbye."
they
And
literally, they were using human beings, mothers, brothers, sisters, fathers, daughters, sons, cousins, friends, human beings, individual human beings, like they were pieces of like tools you can buy at Home Depot. That's what they were doing. And then once that tool was broken, they discarded it with no questions asked. So we gotta go. I'm gonna go back. We want to generalize the Jewish people as these victims and all this stuff, but talk about individual Nazis and not generalize them. We want to talk about, well, they didn't run the camp, so were they as bad? Or bring up the discussion we had in this history class I worked in at the high school before I moved back to the middle school. Um, where do you draw the line on which Nazis were bad? Because do you draw the line at just Nazi soldiers, Nazi officers, people working in the camps, whatever? But what about little innocent grandma who lives a street away from the camps and smells the burning and cleans ash off her car every day, and that ash is human people, and then says under oath that she had no clue what was going on? There's no way in hell she didn't know what was going on. You could smell it from miles.
I
Did we let her go?
I think so. I think that there is some culpability there. I think to say that there was no way they didn't know what was going on is a little unfair, though, because there were lies told to them. Like, yes, they knew that bodies were being burned and the ashes were from, you know, cremated bodies,
But we're not
but
talking somebody who lived in
they
like inland away from these camps. We're talking somebody who lived a block away, could see the camp.
okay. Yeah, there's no way that they didn't know if they were that close. Literally, they would contract out Jewish prisoners to work for people in villages. So there's no way that people didn't know that they were being used for slave labor. It's just not possible. I mean,
And you
on
can
the other
justify it.
hand,
You could justify it by saying all they knew was that they were being used for slave labor, and they didn't know that they were um killing them and doing all those monstrosities and stuff. But is that not enough to know? It's
right.
like that's
And
inhumane
you
enough, especially in 1937. This isn't freaking 1400.
and you can argue that they were afraid of meeting the same fate and that's why they didn't speak up. But in the book, she talks about some of the political prisoners who were in the camps with them because they went against the Nazis. And while they're in the camps, they have this like hierarchy in their heads where they make it very clear that they think that they're better than the Jewish prisoners.
And
So,
I'm very glad that you brought that point up, because she makes a point in um the book. I believe it's about the Polish, and Hitler hated the Polish and sent them to camps and all this stuff too, which was true, and she didn't deny that once in the book. But she did say very clearly that there was still a difference between Polish people and Polish Jews and how they were treated and how they were handled.
absolutely. Um, and I want to discuss a little bit about how Ruth describes things such as PTSD in these vivid ways that if you didn't understand what PTSD was before, you definitely will now. There's a part in the book where she says, about 12 years later, I watched Susie, who is like a sister to me, as she plays with her small daughters in the sand. I hear her soothing, superior sounding voice. Do this or don't do that, she says. Suddenly, I see us as we were, Susie's arm around me, the two of us crouching in the quarry in the cold wind. I turn away from her and the children, for the sand has solidified to Silesian granite, and the children's game has become threatening. Like, that is an amazing way to describe what it is to feel PTSD.
So I think it's an important thing to mention with that too, is as someone who's um dealt with people who have really close to me who've had PTSD and stuff and seen them,
Hmm.
what she described there is exactly what happened. She like it's not just a vision in her head or a memory. Like when she got like that flashback, like that was a flashback. Like they were gone. Like it was that moment. Like she was literally seeing that moment for real. Like that's what her reality and her life was right then and there. You
Mhm.
get what I'm saying? Like she was
Yes.
back there, and that moment, those when she said those kids faded away and the kids' game was gone, it was gone. It wasn't, oh, this brought me back and I remembered that. Like, no, in that moment,
Right.
she was right there again.
Right. And now, obviously, that's not the only way you can experience PTSD. I have PTSD, and I experience it through insomnia and anxiety. But
Yeah,
it is
absolutely. I
a
don't want to minimize it either. So
right. But I think that is such a fantastic way of illustrating it. Like the language she uses, the descriptions, it's such a great way. And it shows that because a lot of people have this idea that once the camps were liberated, everybody was fine, everybody went on with their lives, and it was like happily ever after. And nobody thinks about the people who were, um, victims of the Holocaust after they were no longer in the camps. Um, I think it's a really good way to be like, yes, she survived. She and Susie survived. Um, they went through this horrible thing. They went on to have lives. Susie even had children, but that it's still something they carry with them for the rest of their lives. It
he had
affects their
children
daily
too, by the way.
lives. Yes, yeah, I know that, but in this
Um,
specific example, it was talking about Susie's children.
but
But you know what I'm saying? Like it
it
still
brings
affects
me
their lives.
to a line from one of my favorite movies, Across the Universe. To the end of the movie when Max returned from Vietnam and Jude is like, "Hey man, you look great. How's everything doing? You look normal." And he's like, "Everything from the neck down works perfectly fine." And
Yeah,
that's exactly what it was.
right.
Um,
Yes.
I
That's a
think
really great example.
another thing to like mention about the liberation of the camps and stuff is it's quickly addressed in the books and stuff. When the camps were liberated and stuff, and how they went to go live in refugee camps until they could figure out like what to do for them and stuff.
Mhm.
Um, that didn't happen overnight. That didn't happen at the liberation of the camps. When these camps were
Right,
liberated, it was literally these soldiers would show up to the gates, unlock the gates, and open them and be like, "Go somewhere," and that was
right.
that.
And
And we don't
and the
talk about that part and like look at like what the hell there and like what they had to go through after liberation too enough because
right,
when the story of the Holocaust is told, it has a start and it has a finish, right? The start is
right.
1937, or I guess the official start for it would have been Kristallnacht, but the
Um,
anti-Semitism and like the underlying hatred towards Jews on a systematic level started well before that. Um, and then it ends in 1945 at the Battle of Berlin when Hitler commits suicide and the war is over. But that's
right.
not true. That's not the ending at
No,
all. So we don't
no,
go to the part where these camps were liberated and it was just millions of Jews who just were like, gates are open, go find society. And we like to have happy endings. Like when we do books, when we read
right,
stories, when we do things, we like happy endings. So we just talk about, oh, they were liberated and the Americans and the Soviets and the Allies, we saved them and that was that. No more Holocaust. They had to go be re-implemented into society, a society that still hated Jews,
and it's also
a society that still hates Jews. And I know that's a very
yes,
blunt thing to say, but it's true.
right. There's all kinds of conspiracy theories against Jews. Um, and a lot of people will look at the situation and be like, "Oh, as soon as the soldiers appeared and liberated the camp, everybody was saved, everybody was good. They had a lot of recovery to do, but recovery started right then." But a lot of people still died between that point and, the eventual,
Yeah.
you know,
First,
saving of them being able to go other places. Because if somebody was on the brink of death when the soldiers showed up, they weren't getting help immediately. So you had people dying of starvation and disease in the period of time between the liberation and the assistance,
yeah, and these soldiers that showed up, it's not like they were the Red Cross or like United Nations soldiers. There wasn't even the United Nations yet then. Um,
Right,
these were 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old boys who were
right.
in way over
Because
their head, and they saw these people. So, a lot of them died too from the soldiers just trying to care for them because the soldiers didn't understand how to care
right,
for someone when they were that malnourished either.
right,
Like
right.
they were just throwing food at them and stuff, thinking that's gonna help them. They really need to eat, and you gotta increment that slowly too. So
And a lot of and people be like, "What are you talking about? Soldiers, you have to be 18 to be a soldier." Technically true, but you have to remember that back then things weren't computerized. That wasn't even a pipe dream yet. All records and stuff were on paper. So it was very easy for people to sign up for the military and lie about their age. And a lot of boys did that because they had this grand idea of being a hero as a soldier, partially because there was so much propaganda.
and
Um, so it was literally, you could literally have teenage boys who technically don't have their driver's licenses yet coming upon these camps and being expected to help people who went through an atrocity at a level that was unheard of prior to this.
yeah, and I just want to make a point too that like in most of our lifetimes, I'm assuming probably all our viewers lifetimes here that we haven't experienced a draft and stuff. I'm not sure if we have any older viewers who have like Vietnam time and stuff. Um,
Yeah.
with that said,
I mean, we
this
might,
was a
but
this was a world war, and not just a world war. This was the biggest world war. This was like massively bigger than World War One, to the point where
yeah,
we were drafting soldiers just so we can have enough men. If somebody was coming up to
yeah,
enlist, we weren't really paying attention to that documentation because we were taking anybody who was willing.
right,
So between falsifying documents and then them not really checking over documents, it was very easy for a 16-year-old to serve.
right.
I think the youngest casualty on Omaha Beach for D-Day was a 14-year-old kid.
That sounds accurate.
I will have to double check that, but I believe that was correct. So with that said, I know some of our viewers are teachers and stuff. Imagine your high school student stumbling upon a concentration camp and then being expected to care for millions of Jewish people and think that that's a happy ending and all ended well.
Right,
A couple
right.
years ago, an NFL player made a very anti-Semitic remark, and later on, he tweeted a half-hearted apology about the anti-Semitic remark he made, and there was nothing done about it because in the year 2023, just like in the year 1937, we are still in a place where anti-Semitism isn't taken as seriously as it should be. Um,
Yeah,
so, um, really quickly, just because this podcast is about books we read and how they relate to us, we are Jewish, and I am here today because I was born in 1995 in America. If I was
yep,
I could have easily been born in a different time, in a different place, and I would have personally faced what they went through. And anybody could say that. You don't even have to be Jewish to say that. It's just, if you think this couldn't happen to you and you don't take this seriously and look at the seriousness of this, that is how something like this happens in the first place. This is a conversation that is very dear to my heart. I feel a lot of emotion when talking about this because I am Jewish and I
Right.
do feel to them. But this is something that could be said for any minorities, and I think it's just it's a time to really just sit back and think about it on an individual level of what we could all do better.
Right.
Um, I'm gonna just read a quote from the Holocaust Museum that I think sums up what I'm trying to say here and why this is an important conversation to have and why this does affect every person, even if you're not Jewish, if you're not Polish, not gay, not Roma, whatever may be, if you weren't um, an ethnicity, political group, social group, even a type of employment that was affected by the Holocaust directly, it still affects you. And this quote sums it up. They came first for the communists. I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me, and by that time, no one was left to speak up.
So, Matt, big question. Do you recommend this book?
With a very heavy heart and a much warning about the emotional context of this book, I do recommend this book.
I agree. I recommend it as well.
With a disclaimer that I would
You
not
may
read
have
this
to read
book
it in
if,
pieces.
and I wouldn't read it if you are under 18, and I wouldn't let anybody under 18 read it.
I appreciate that opinion. I disagree. I think that it's really important um, for teens to read this. Um, I
Well,
think that it
18 might be a
needs to
little
be,
old, and I admit that. And I thought that when I said it, but I mean, there's an
but
age cutoff, and I don't think like you have to be an age where you can take something like this seriously.
right. Or at least have the guidance of somebody who could help you. And I agree that it's probably best for teenagers who are more mature, but it's definitely an important read.
I just want to say thank you guys for listening with us today and taking this journey with us because this was a hard topic to talk about, and we really appreciate you guys listening and being part of this conversation because these are the conversations that will change the world. With that said, Tracy, you want to tell them what's coming up next week?
Sure. So next week we're going to return to our usual format where we read and approach the book that we're reading with a little bit of humor, a less serious discussion. We are going to read I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. We feel like this is a good bridge book between the content we discussed today that involved trauma and the content that we are usually, you know, producing, which is things with humor. And this book definitely toes the line with trauma and humor, and it's a good gateway.
Um, I think I will give a disclaimer for this book before next week too. It's not going to be as heavy as this week, but just be warned that there might be a few triggering things.
Yes. So, all right, guys, thanks for
Until
joining
next
us.
time.
Bye.